It lies on a mirrored surface, a tiny white mound like powdered sugar. The light from a tactical flashlight shatters it into a myriad of glittering shards. Each crystal is a perfect sinister geometry, a promise of inhuman energy. The air in the room is thick, saturated with the acrid smell of chemicals, ammonia, and stale sweat. It is the stench of despair, cooked in dirty dishes on a rusty stove. Off camera, the crackle of a radio can be heard, muffled commands, the heavy, constricted breathing of people in hazmat suits. But here, in this narrow beam of light, an absolute, almost sacred silence reigns. This powder is the end product of a long, bloody journey across continents and centuries. A journey that began not in this clandestine laboratory, but on the windswept plateaus of Central Asia. Before there was methamphetamine, there was a shrub. This time, not the opium poppy with its seductive flowers, but something far more ancient, humble, and hardy. The mahuang plant, ephedra. A gnarled, sinewy bush clinging for millions of years to the rocky soil in the vast expanses of China and Mongolia. Its crooked, knotted branches and tiny, scale-like leaves seem unremarkable. It is the kind of vegetation you would walk past without a second glance, brushing the dust from your boot. But for more than 5,000 years, practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine knew its innermost secret. They called it ma huang, yellow hemp, and brewed its dried straw-like stems into a bitter, astringent tea. This tea, steaming in a clay bowl, treated asthma, cleared congested lungs, and invigorated a weary body after a long trek across the desert. The active substance responsible for these effects was ephedrine, though the ancient healers could not have known this, attributing the power to the plant's spirits. A simple molecule, an alkaloid, a gift from nature that stimulates the central nervous system, constricts blood vessels, and opens the airways like a gust of fresh mountain wind. It was a natural stimulant, a gift from a harsh desert plant to humankind. For millennia, this was enough. The knowledge remained largely in the East, a folk remedy passed from healer to healer, its recipe whispered from generation to generation. So it continued until the great clash of civilizations brought Western science face to face with Eastern wisdom at the thunderous close of the 19th century. In 1885, a young Japanese chemist named Nagai Nagayoshi found himself in the very heart of a scientific revolution in Berlin under the tutelage of the legendary August Wilhelm von Hofmann. Nagai was fascinated by the traditional medicines of his homeland and saw in the rigorous, analytical chemistry of the West the tools to unlock their secrets at a molecular level. He returned to Japan with a mission to isolate and identify the active components of ma huang. His laboratory, reeking of acids and caustic reagents, became his sanctuary. Working scrupulously, with almost religious tenacity, he extracted, crystallized, and purified the substance. He toiled until, in his hands, in a cold glass flask, lay the pure, glittering crystals of ephedrine, reflecting the light of the gas lamps. He had given the ancient remedy a modern chemical identity. But Nagai did not stop there. He was a chemist, and chemists, by their nature, are creators and destroyers. They take molecules apart like clockwork mechanisms and reassemble them in new, unseen configurations, striving to improve upon what nature had created. In 1893, Nagai performed a seemingly simple chemical modification in the quiet of his laboratory. He took his purified ephedrine and subjected it to a process called reduction, using red phosphorus and iodine to cleave off a single oxygen atom and add one methyl group. The result was a new compound, a molecule that existed nowhere in nature. He named it methamphetamine. At the time, it was nothing more than a scientific curiosity, a footnote in an obscure Japanese chemical journal gathering dust on a shelf. Nagai published his findings, modestly noting that the new substance appeared to have stimulant properties even more pronounced than those of ephedrine itself. But he had no pharmaceutical application in mind, nor the slightest idea of the genie he had let out of the bottle. It would take another war, another nation, and another chemist to see the terrible potential locked within that simple, elegant molecule. The second chapter of this saga unfolds in Germany, in the grim years after the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed the German economy and national pride, leaving the nation in a state of profound humiliation and despair. But German chemistry, Germany's pharmaceutical might, remained unsurpassed, a world-class titan. Companies like Bayer, Merck, and a rising star named Temmler were world leaders in synthesizing new drugs. In 1919, building on Nagai's work, another Japanese chemist, Akira Ogata, developed a more efficient method for synthesizing methamphetamine. He used ephedrine as the starting material and applied a process called reductive amination, which produced the drug in a pure crystalline form. This method was cheaper, faster, and more reliable. The formula was now available, waiting for its moment, its sinister purpose. It was the German pharmaceutical company Temmler that brought methamphetamine out of the quiet of the laboratory and onto the brightly lit shelves of pharmacies. In 1934, they began selling it under the catchy trade name Pervitin. The timing could not have been more perfect or more sinister. Germany was in the throes of a national transformation, in the fever of a new dark ideology. Adolf Hitler had just come to power, and his vision of a 1,000-year Reich demanded a populace that was energetic, tireless, and utterly devoted to the state. Pervitin seemed to be the perfect chemical fuel for this new order. The drug was sold over the counter, available to everyone. It came in small, innocuous white tablets engraved with the Temmler logo, resembling mints. The marketing was brilliant and pervasive. Pervitin was promoted as a cure for depression, a remedy for narcolepsy, a dietary aid for the overweight, and a stimulant for students and workers. Advertising posters plastered all over Germany depicted beaming housewives who could clean their homes with boundless energy, factory workers who never tired, and students who could study all night without sleeping a wink. And it worked. The drug delivered exactly what it promised, and even more. A single dose flooded the brain with dopamine, creating a feeling of euphoria, omnipotence, and boundless stamina. Fatigue evaporated like morning dew. Hunger disappeared. The user felt invincible, focused, and extremely alert. It was an industrialist's dream, a pill that could turn a worker into a machine, a cog in a flawless state mechanism. Within a few years, Pervitin became incredibly popular throughout Germany, a true cultural phenomenon. Millions of tablets were sold every month. It became as common an item in the German household as aspirin or a bandage. But the real transformation, the one that would forever cement methamphetamine's place in history, occurred when men in military uniforms took notice of it. In 1938, as Hitler prepared to plunge the world into war, the German High Command faced a fundamental logistical problem. Modern warfare, as they envisioned it, would be a war of speed, pressure, and endurance. The Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, strategy required soldiers who could march for days without rest, tank crews who could drive their vehicles all night, and pilots who could fly sortie after sortie without succumbing to deadly exhaustion. Pervitin was the solution, the chemical key to victory. The Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces, began issuing methamphetamine tablets to its soldiers en masse. They were included in standard field rations, packed in small tin boxes, alongside a bar of chocolate and cigarettes. The soldiers quickly came up with nicknames for them: Tank Chocolate, Panzer Schokolade, or Stuka Pills, Stuka Tabletten, after the dive bombers that terrorized Europe with their blood-curdling wail. The official designation was far more clinical and prosaic. Pervitin was classified as a stimulant for enhancing performance, to be taken as needed during combat operations. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and terrifying. During the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the subsequent swift conquest of France in 1940, German soldiers advanced with a speed and ferocity that stunned and paralyzed the world. They did not sleep. They did not stop. Entire divisions marched for 36, 48, and even 72 hours without rest, their eyes burning with a feverish fire in their dust-covered faces. Tank commanders drove their vehicles in relentless columns day and night, covering distances that Allied military planners considered absolutely impossible. The French and British forces, relying on traditional cycles of combat and rest, were simply swept aside, crushed by this relentless, superhuman speed. They could not understand how the Germans moved so fast. The secret, of course, was chemical, locked within those small white pills. The Wehrmacht consumed methamphetamine on a staggering industrial scale. From April to July 1940, during the invasion of France and the Benelux countries, more than 35 million Pervitin tablets were distributed to the German army and the Luftwaffe. This was enough for every frontline soldier to take several doses a day for several months. It was the first pharmacologically enhanced army in history, a fighting force running on pure synthetic adrenaline. But this wonder drug had its own dark price. Even then, in the euphoria of easy victories, the side effects were becoming frighteningly obvious. Soldiers who took Pervitin for extended periods began to show alarming symptoms. They became paranoid, irritable, and prone to unmotivated aggression. Some experienced vivid hallucinations, seeing enemies in the shadows of trees, trembling from explosions, shooting at nothing. Others suffered from rapid heartbeats and uncontrollable tremors, their hands shaking on the triggers of their rifles. And when the drug's effects wore off, a cruel, crushing come-down would set in. Soldiers would fall into a sleep so deep it resembled a coma. Their bodies, wrung out to the last drop, would simply shut down. Some never woke up, their hearts, worn to the limit, stopping in their sleep. Military doctors began to sound the alarm. Reports reached Berlin of entire units becoming unfit for combat, not due to enemy action, but because of the collapse of their own men, completely exhausted from days and nights of stimulant-induced strain. Reports emerged of soldiers shooting at their own comrades, of officers making irrational, suicidal decisions in the heat of battle, of entire companies losing cohesion and discipline in the grip of a collective psychosis. By 1941, the German High Command, realizing the danger, began to restrict the use of Pervitin, issuing directives that strictly regulated its distribution for specific critical combat situations only. But the genie was already out of the bottle. Soldiers who had tasted the drug's power, its promise of invincibility, were not about to give it up voluntarily. A black market instantly flourished among the troops. Soldiers hoarded their pills, traded them for cigarettes or food, and took them in secret from their officers. Methamphetamine was addictive, and the Wehrmacht, the most formidable military machine in the world, had unwittingly gotten itself hooked. And they were not alone. Around the world, as the war expanded and consumed entire continents, other nations, watching the successes of the Blitzkrieg with a mixture of horror and envy, were discovering the same chemical shortcut to victory. The Allies, who at first dismissed reports of German stimulant use as Nazi propaganda, soon realized the strategic advantage it provided. They began to hastily develop and distribute their own versions of the drug. If the Germans had Pervitin, the British and Americans had Benzedrine. It was not methamphetamine, but its close chemical relative, amphetamine. The difference between them is slight, just a single methyl group. But methamphetamine crosses the blood-brain barrier more easily and produces a more intense and prolonged effect. Amphetamine, however, was considered slightly safer, slightly less addictive, although this was largely a dangerous illusion. Benzedrine had been synthesized back in 1887 by the Romanian chemist Lazar Edelianu, but like methamphetamine, it had languished in obscurity on the shelves of chemical libraries for decades. It wasn't until 1933 that the American pharmaceutical company, Smith, Kline & French, began selling it as an over-the-counter inhaler for nasal congestion. The Benzedrine inhaler became a huge commercial success. It was a simple device, a cardboard tube containing a strip of paper soaked in amphetamine base. You would crack it open, hold it to your nose, and inhale deeply. It instantly cleared the sinuses, but it also delivered a powerful dose of the stimulant directly into the bloodstream through the mucous membrane. Soon, people realized the inhaler could be used for purposes far beyond treating a runny nose. Students discovered that if you broke open the inhaler and ate the paper strip, either by chewing it or dissolving it in morning coffee, you could stay awake for days, preparing for exams with laser-like focus and inhuman concentration. Factory workers used it to endure long, grueling shifts in war plants. By the late 1930s, it had found its way into the hands of athletes, musicians, and anyone looking for a chemical edge in life. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, the military was well aware of Benzedrine's stimulant properties. The Army Air Forces, in particular, saw immense potential in it. B-17 bomber pilots flying daylight raids over Germany faced grueling 10, 12, even 15-hour flights in cramped, freezing, unpressurized cabins at high altitudes under constant anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. The strain was unimaginable, and fatigue was a constant and deadly enemy. Benzedrine tablets, small white pills with a characteristic embossed B, became standard issue for bomber and fighter crews. They called them go pills. Britain's Royal Air Force had been using amphetamines even earlier. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, as the outnumbered RAF pilots flew sortie after sortie against the Luftwaffe's armadas, they were kept airborne with the help of Benzedrine. The drug allowed them to fly 5 or 6 missions a day, suppressing exhaustion and sharpening their reactions to a razor's edge. Arguably, these pills played no small part in Britain's survival during those desperate dark months. The Japanese military also embraced methamphetamine with enthusiasm. In fact, they were arguably its most fervent proponents and consumers. The Japanese pharmaceutical industry had been producing methamphetamine since the 1930s under brand names like Philipon and Sedaton. It was widely available to the civilian population and marketed as a remedy for everything from asthma to lethargy and depression. When Japan entered the war, the military requisitioned vast, unimaginable quantities of the drug. Japanese soldiers, sailors, and pilots were routinely issued methamphetamine tablets as part of their rations. The drug was considered essential for maintaining the fighting spirit, fanatical devotion to the emperor, and suicidal bravery that characterized Japanese military tactics. Kamikaze pilots, the young men preparing to fly their explosive-laden planes into American warships, were reportedly given large doses of methamphetamine before their final, fatal missions. It blunted their fear, sharpened their focus to a tunnel vision, and made the unthinkable not just possible, but a glorious, heroic act. The scale of production was astonishing. By the end of the war, Japanese pharmaceutical companies had produced billions of methamphetamine pills. The drug was so ubiquitous that it was often included in care packages sent from home to soldiers on the front lines, alongside rice cakes and letters from relatives. It was a cultural phenomenon, a substance woven into the very fabric of the nation's war effort. But the most disturbing use of methamphetamine during the war, perhaps, occurred at the highest stratospheric levels of the Nazi regime. Adolf Hitler himself, the architect of the Third Reich, was almost certainly a heavy methamphetamine addict by the mid-1940s. His personal physician, the corpulent and sycophantic Dr. Theodor Morell, kept detailed, meticulous records of the injections he administered to the Führer. Beginning in 1942, as the tide of the war turned against Germany, Morell began giving Hitler daily injections of a substance he called Vitamultin. In reality, it was a potent cocktail of vitamins, hormones, opiates, and, most importantly, pure methamphetamine. The effect on Hitler's health and decision-making was profound and devastating. Those who knew him well, members of his inner circle, reported that he became increasingly erratic, paranoid, and detached from reality. He would stay awake for days on end, pacing the rooms of his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing contradictory, frantic orders, ranting about enemies both real and imagined. His famous left-hand tremor, visible in late-war footage he tried so hard to conceal, may have been a direct symptom of chronic methamphetamine use. The drug that had once powered the Wehrmacht to stunning victories was now poisoning the mind of the man who commanded it, leading the Reich to its inevitable doom. By the time the war ended in 1945, methamphetamine and amphetamine had been used by millions of soldiers and civilians on both sides of the conflict. Hundreds of millions, if not billions, of doses had been produced and distributed. An entire generation had been introduced to the power of synthetic stimulants, and many of them carried that knowledge and that nascent addiction into the fragile post-war world. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, Japan lay in smoldering ruins. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had vaporized entire cities. The industrial base was destroyed, the economy was shattered, and millions of demoralized soldiers were returning home to a country they no longer recognized. They were defeated, humiliated, and deeply traumatized, and they were about to inherit a chemical problem that would define the next 2 decades of Japanese history. The Japanese military had accumulated enormous, colossal stockpiles of methamphetamine in preparation for a final, desperate defense of the home islands. A defense that was never to be. When the war suddenly ended, these stockpiles, tons and tons of pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine in pills and ampules, were left lying in military warehouses and army depots across the country. The Allied occupation authorities, focused on disarmament, demilitarization, and reconstruction, paid little attention to these chemical arsenals. After all, it was just medicine. In the chaos of the post-war period, the black market reacted with lightning speed. Former soldiers, many of whom were already addicted to the stimulants they had been issued during the war, broke into the warehouses and looted the supplies. The Yakuza gangs, Japan's organized crime syndicates, saw a golden opportunity and quickly took control of wholesale distribution. Methamphetamine literally flooded the streets of Tokyo, Osaka, and every city and village across the archipelago. The drug was sold almost openly from street stalls with virtually no interference from the overwhelmed and understaffed police. It was cheap, abundant, and devastatingly effective at dulling the physical and mental pain of a nation in mourning. People took it to work longer hours in the brutal conditions of post-war reconstruction, clearing rubble and building new lives from the ashes. Students took it to study in unheated classrooms. Housewives took it to cope with the crushing burden of survival in a country with no food, no fuel, and seemingly no hope. By 1948, conservative estimates suggested that nearly 5% of Japan's entire population, some 2 million people, were regularly using methamphetamine. The social consequences were catastrophic, a veritable plague. Crime rates skyrocketed as addicts, gripped by drug-induced paranoia and aggression, committed senseless and violent acts. Families fell apart. Psychiatric hospitals were overwhelmed with patients suffering from stimulant psychosis, a condition characterized by vivid hallucinations, persecutory delusions, and violent behavior, virtually indistinguishable from schizophrenia. The very fabric of Japanese society, built on order and restraint, seemed to be coming apart. The government, once it realized the scale of the disaster, responded with draconian, merciless measures. In 1951, the Stimulants Control Law was passed, which overnight criminalized the production, sale, and possession of methamphetamine. The punishments were harsh, the prison sentences long. The police launched a massive campaign of raids, arresting tens of thousands of users and dealers. The Yakuza, ever resilient and flexible, adapted, moving their operations deep underground and diversifying into other criminal enterprises. Nearly a decade of brutal struggle followed, but by the late 1950s, Japan had largely contained its first methamphetamine epidemic. The drug never completely disappeared. It remained a fixture of the criminal underworld, but was no longer the existential crisis it had been in the immediate post-war years. However, Japan's experience became a grim foreshadowing, an ominous prophecy of what awaited the rest of the world. The drug, created in a lab, weaponized by warring nations, and unleashed upon a desperate population, was now at large. It had its own logic, its own momentum, and it was just beginning its global destructive journey. While Japan was battling its methamphetamine crisis, the United States was having a quieter but no less significant introduction to amphetamines. The war had introduced millions of American GIs to benzedrine, and many returned home with a habit. But the real explosion of amphetamine use in America came not from returning soldiers, but from the medical establishment and the all-powerful pharmaceutical industry. In the 1950s, an era of economic boom and social conformity, amphetamines were still considered miracle drugs. They were prescribed liberally for a staggering array of conditions. If you were tired, your doctor might give you amphetamines. If you were sad, amphetamines. If you were overweight, amphetamines. If you had trouble concentrating, amphetamines. Children diagnosed with what was then vaguely called hyperactivity were given amphetamines to calm them down, a paradoxical effect that would later be better understood as a treatment for ADHD. The drug was sold under dozens of brand names: Dexedrine, Adderall, Benzedrine, and even Desoxyn, yes, Desoxyn, which is pure pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine, was and still is FDA approved for treating ADHD and obesity, though it is prescribed extremely rarely today. Pharmaceutical companies, seeing the immense profit potential, marketed these drugs aggressively to doctors. Medical journals were filled with glossy ads depicting happy, energetic patients whose lives had been transformed by a simple white pill. The cultural impact was deep and pervasive. Amphetamines became firmly embedded in the American way of life, its invisible fuel. Long-haul truck drivers hauling cargo across the vast expanses of the new interstate highways took them to stay awake on marathon trips. They called them white crosses or bennies, and they were as common in the cab of a truck as a thermos of coffee. Students, especially at elite Ivy League universities, used them to cram for exams, pulling all-nighters fueled by Dexedrine. But the largest group of consumers was housewives. Stuck in the suffocating conformity of 1950s suburban life, they took diet pills prescribed by their doctors to lose weight and find the energy to maintain their immaculate homes and perfect families. These were the mother's little helpers that the Rolling Stones sang about. The medical community, for the most part, saw no cause for alarm. Amphetamines were considered safe, non-addictive when used as directed, and immensely beneficial. But beneath this glossy veneer of respectability, a darker, more sinister picture was emerging. People who took amphetamines for extended periods began to need higher and higher doses to achieve the same effect. They developed a tolerance, and when they tried to stop, they experienced crushing fatigue, profound depression, and an almost unbearable craving for the drug. They were addicted, even if no one wanted to call it that. By the early 1960s, the United States was consuming more amphetamines per capita than any other nation on Earth. Pharmaceutical companies were producing billions of pills a year, far more than could be plausibly accounted for by legitimate medical use. The surplus was leaking onto the black market, into the hands of teenagers, into the bloodstream of a generation. And then came the counterculture. The 1960s were a decade of rebellion, social upheaval, and chemical exploration. Young people, rejecting the values of their parents, turned to drugs as a form of liberation and consciousness expansion. Marijuana, LSD, mescaline, all became symbols of a new consciousness, a psychedelic revolution. But alongside these psychedelics, amphetamines also found their place in the counterculture. Speed became the street name, a reference to its rapid onset and intense, jittery high. It was popular in the burgeoning hippie communes of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. Artists, musicians, and poets like Jack Kerouac used it to fuel marathon creative sessions. But speed had a darker, more aggressive edge than the other drugs of the era. It didn't expand the mind, it narrowed it to a pinpoint. It made users focused, obsessive, and paranoid. It fueled not enlightenment, but mania. The Hells Angels, an outlaw biker gang that became synonymous with the violent, dark underbelly of the 1960s counterculture, were deeply involved in the amphetamine trade. They produced and distributed methamphetamine, which they cooked in primitive labs in rural areas using recipes that had circulated since the war. This was not the clean, pharmaceutical-grade Desoxyn. This was dirty, homemade meth, cooked up in filthy kitchens and garages, cut with toxic impurities. and sold in small paper packets to anyone with cash. The phrase "speed kills" emerged in the late 1960s. It was coined by anti-drug activists who saw the devastation the drug was causing in their communities. It was on posters, repeated in public service announcements, and became a mantra of despair. But for many users, the warning came too late. Methamphetamine addiction, they discovered, was a special personal kind of hell. The high was intense, but short-lived. The subsequent come-down was crushing, and the only way to avoid it was to take more. Chronic users, known as speed freaks, would go without sleep for days, even weeks, on edge, twitching, picking at their skin in the obsessive belief that bugs were crawling underneath it. They lost weight dramatically, becoming walking skeletons. Their teeth rotted and fell out, a condition later known as meth mouth. Their behavior became erratic and violent. Methamphetamine psychosis was common, a state in which the user completely lost touch with reality, experiencing paranoid delusions and vivid, terrifying hallucinations. The federal government, alarmed by the rising tide of addiction and the moral panic it fueled, began to crack down. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse, Prevention and Control Act of 1970, signed into law by President Nixon, classified amphetamines and methamphetamine as Schedule II controlled substances, recognizing their high potential for abuse, but allowing for limited medical use. Prescriptions became harder to obtain. The pharmaceutical industry, under pressure, drastically cut back production. By the end of the 1970s, the freewheeling era of over-the-counter amphetamine availability was a thing of the past. But this crackdown had an unintended and catastrophic consequence. It didn't eliminate the demand. It merely shifted production. As pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine became harder to get, the black market expanded to fill the void. And the people who filled it were not chemists in white lab coats, but criminals in makeshift labs. The meth they produced was dirtier, more dangerous, and more addictive than anything that had come before. The era of super labs and ruthless Mexican cartels was about to begin. By the 1980s, methamphetamine in America had undergone a complete transformation. It was no longer the white crosses handed out by doctors or the pharmaceutical desoxin from the pharmacy. It was an illicit drug produced in clandestine labs, sold by criminal organizations, and consumed by an increasingly desperate and marginalized population. The first wave of illegal methamphetamine production in the U.S. was small-scale and scattered. Biker gangs, particularly the Hells Angels and their affiliates, ran primitive labs in rural California and the Southwest, using a synthesis method known as the P2P, or phenyl-2-propanone method. This method required precursors that were relatively easy to obtain and a simple, though extremely dangerous, cooking process. The resulting product was often impure and weak, but it was cheap and available. Then, in the 1980s, two events changed everything. The first was the discovery of a new, more efficient synthesis method called the ephedrine reduction method, also known as the Nazi method, because it was based on a process developed in Germany during World War II. This method used ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, the active ingredients in over-the-counter cold medicines, as its starting material. It was simpler, faster, and yielded a much purer and more potent product than the P2P method, and, critically, the precursors were legal and widely available at any pharmacy. The second event was the rise of Mexican drug cartels. These organizations, which had grown rich and powerful on the marijuana and cocaine trade, saw in methamphetamine a new, incredibly profitable product line. They had the infrastructure, the distribution networks, and the chemical expertise to produce the drug on an industrial scale. And they had something the American biker gangs did not: access to vast quantities of precursors. The cartels built super labs, giant clandestine facilities capable of producing hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine in a single batch. These were not the dirty kitchens and garages of the biker era. These were sophisticated, high-tech operations, often hidden in remote warehouses or rural properties in Mexico, equipped with industrial-grade glassware, ventilation systems, and a staff of trained chemists. The methamphetamine they produced was of astonishingly high purity, often exceeding 90%. The logistics of the trafficking were no less impressive. The cartels moved the finished product across the border in cars, with specially constructed hidden compartments, in trucks carrying legitimate cargo, and even through elaborate tunnels dug beneath the border fence. Once in the United States, it was distributed through a vast network of dealers and sub-dealers, reaching every city and town across the country. The price was low, the purity was high, and the availability was unprecedented. By the 1990s, methamphetamine use had exploded, particularly in rural and small-town America, in the so-called Rust Belt and the Midwest. These were communities that had been largely bypassed by the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, which was concentrated mainly in large urban centers. Methamphetamine, by contrast, thrived in the heartland. It was popular among the white working class, construction workers, farmers, factory laborers, people who used it not for recreation, but to work longer hours, to cope with the grueling demands of low-wage, physically demanding jobs. But the drug had another, more seductive appeal. It was a social drug, a party drug. Unlike heroin, which sedated and isolated users, methamphetamine energized and connected them. It was used at all-night raves, in bars, in living rooms where groups of friends would get high together, talking compulsively for hours on end, taking apart and reassembling household appliances, engaging in marathon, emotionless sex sessions. It created a false chemical sense of intimacy and camaraderie that felt entirely real in the moment, but evaporated without a trace in the harsh, depressive light of the come-down. The human cost of this new epidemic was staggering and horrifying. Methamphetamine destroyed families from the inside out. Parents, completely consumed by the drug, neglected and abused their children. The foster care systems in states like Iowa, Oklahoma, and Oregon were overwhelmed with cases of addicted parents and children found in unimaginable filth and squalor. Entire communities were destabilized, crime rates soared, domestic violence, burglaries, and assaults all skyrocketed in areas with high rates of meth use. And then there was the environmental damage. The production of methamphetamine is a dirty, toxic process. For every pound of meth produced, 5 to 6 pounds of hazardous chemical waste are created: solvents, acids, heavy metals, and other poisons. The cooks would simply dispose of this waste, pouring it down drains, burying it in backyards, or dumping it in barrels in rural fields. Properties where meth labs operated became toxic waste sites, contaminated and uninhabitable for decades. The authorities responded with a strategy that had worked to some extent in the past: cutting off access to precursor chemicals. In the 1990s and early 2000s, laws were passed restricting the sale of products containing ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 required these products to be kept behind the counter in pharmacies, limited the amount an individual could purchase at one time, and mandated that buyers show identification and sign a logbook. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Small-scale domestic meth labs, the so-called shake and bake operations run by individual users in their kitchens and motel rooms, were all but wiped out. Without easy access to cold medicine, they could no longer cook. The number of lab seizures in the United States plummeted. For a moment, it seemed like the problem was solved. But the cartels, as always, adapted. They simply moved their entire production operation to Mexico, where precursor chemicals could still be sourced in bulk, smuggled from China and India. Super labs south of the border ramped up production to unprecedented, mind-boggling levels. The methamphetamine that flowed back into the United States was cheaper, purer, and more available than ever before. The problem of domestic production had been solved, but the problem of consumption had only gotten worse. Today, we are living in the midst of the worst methamphetamine crisis in human history. The numbers are staggering and unequivocal. In 2020, nearly 2.5 million Americans reported using methamphetamine in the past year. Overdose deaths involving methamphetamine have increased more than fivefold since 2012. In 2021, more than 32,000 Americans died from overdoses involving psychostimulants, primarily methamphetamine. That's more than one death every 15 minutes. But the crisis has long since ceased to be a purely American problem. Methamphetamine is now a global pandemic. In Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand, the Philippines, and Myanmar, the drug is known as yaba, which means crazy medicine in Thai. It is produced in vast quantities in the lawless border regions of the Golden Triangle, the same region that once produced most of the world's heroin. The production facilities are enormous, industrial-scale operations capable of producing millions of pills per month. In Australia, methamphetamine, known as ice, has become the country's most serious drug problem. Its per capita use is higher than almost anywhere else in the world. The drug is smuggled in by international criminal syndicates, hidden in shipping containers, air cargo, and even in liquid form in wine bottles. The Australian government has spent billions trying to stop the flow, but with very limited success. In the Czech Republic and other parts of Eastern Europe, a homemade form of methamphetamine called Pervitin, the same name as the Nazi-era drug, is produced in small-scale labs and is widely used by young people. In South Africa, a smokable form called tick has devastated entire communities in impoverished townships. The drug has found a foothold in every corner of the globe, adapting to local cultures, economies, and trafficking routes. Methamphetamine today differs from the drug of previous eras in one critical aspect: purity. Cartels have perfected the synthesis process to such a degree that the average purity of methamphetamine seized at the U.S. border now exceeds 95%. This is a pharmaceutical-grade product produced by skilled chemists using industrial equipment. The days of dirty, weak biker meth are long gone. This ultra-high purity has devastating consequences. Users accustomed to a lower purity product can easily overdose when encountering the new super-pure meth. And because methamphetamine is a stimulant, not a depressant like heroin or fentanyl, overdoses manifest differently. Instead of respiratory depression, meth overdoses often involve malignant hyperthermia, a massive stroke, heart attack, or fatal seizures. The user's body is simply pushed to the limit of its physiological capabilities. The heart beats so fast that it fails, the brain overheats to the point of irreversible damage. And then there is the problem of polysubstance use. In recent years, methamphetamine has been increasingly used in combination with opioids, especially the synthetic and ultra-potent fentanyl. This combination, known colloquially as a speedball, is particularly lethal. The stimulant properties of meth mask the sedative effects of the opioid, causing users to take far more fentanyl than they realize, leading to a sudden overdose. Conversely, when the meth wears off, the full depressive effect of the fentanyl hits all at once, stopping their breathing. These two drugs together have created a new, even more deadly and complex form of the overdose crisis. Methamphetamine also causes a unique set of long-term health problems. Chronic use is associated with severe rapid tooth decay, the infamous meth mouth, caused by a combination of dry mouth, poor hygiene, teeth grinding, and the corrosive effects of the drug itself. Users develop open, non-healing sores on their skin, a result of compulsive picking at imaginary bugs crawling under the skin, a symptom of a tactile hallucination known as formication, which is part of methamphetamine-induced psychosis. The drug is neurotoxic, meaning it directly damages and kills brain cells, particularly in areas responsible for memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Long-term users often suffer from severe cognitive impairments that persist even after they stop using. The psychiatric effects are no less severe. Methamphetamine use can trigger full-blown psychosis, a state nearly indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia. Users experience auditory and visual hallucinations, persecutory delusions, and extreme paranoia. They become convinced they are being watched, that people are plotting against them, that law enforcement is closing in. This psychosis can persist for weeks or even months after the drug has left their system. In some cases, it becomes permanent, leaving the person forever in a world of shadows and fear. And, perhaps most insidiously, methamphetamine profoundly and lastingly alters the brain's reward system. It floods the brain with dopamine at levels far exceeding any natural reward. Over time, the brain adapts by reducing its own dopamine production and decreasing the number of dopamine receptors. This leaves the user in a state of profound anhedonia, an inability to feel pleasure from normal activities. Food doesn't taste good, music doesn't move them, love doesn't feel the same. The only thing that can cut through this chemical stupor is more methamphetamine. It is a neurological prison, a cage built by the brain's own adaptive mechanisms. To understand why methamphetamine causes such a devastating addiction, we need to look inside the skull, into the complex chemistry of the brain. The human brain operates on a delicate system of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. One of the most important is dopamine, often called the reward chemical or the motivation molecule. Dopamine is released when we do something beneficial for our survival, eating delicious food, having sex, achieving a goal. It creates a feeling of pleasure and satisfaction and teaches the brain to repeat the behavior that caused its release. Methamphetamine hijacks this ancient survival system with brutal, crude efficiency. A normal, pleasurable activity, like a delicious dinner, can cause dopamine levels in the brain's synapses to increase by 50–100% above baseline. Methamphetamine causes it to increase by 1,200% or more. It doesn't just tickle the reward system, it blasts it, causing a tsunami of dopamine. The rush of euphoria is so intense, so overwhelming, that the brain's learning system instantly encodes it as the most important experience imaginable, more important than food, water, or sex. But methamphetamine doesn't just increase dopamine release. It also blocks its reuptake, preventing it from being reabsorbed by neurons, and inhibits the enzyme that breaks down dopamine, causing it to linger in the synapse for much longer than it should. The result is a sustained, artificially prolonged stream of pleasure signals. The high can last from 8 to 12 hours, which is much longer than that of cocaine or most other stimulants. The problem is that the brain is not designed for this level of stimulation. It responds by making protective adjustments. Neurons reduce the number of dopamine receptors on their surface, a process called downregulation. The brain also cuts back on its own natural production of dopamine. This is the brain's desperate attempt to restore homeostasis, to protect itself from overstimulation. But this has a catastrophic side effect. When the drug wears off and dopamine levels return to normal, the user is now operating with fewer receptors and less natural dopamine than before. He is in a state of profound dopamine deficit. Nothing brings pleasure, nothing brings joy. He is depressed, apathetic, and empty. And his brain, having learned that methamphetamine is the only thing that can restore feelings, screams for another dose. This is the neurochemical basis of addiction. The brain has been fundamentally reprogrammed to need the drug to function normally. To understand the modern methamphetamine crisis, we must understand the organizations that produce and distribute this drug. Mexican cartels are not street gangs. They are sophisticated, vertically integrated criminal enterprises with annual revenues measured in the tens of billions of dollars. Essentially, they are shadow multinational corporations, and methamphetamine is one of their most profitable product lines. The two dominant cartels in the methamphetamine trade are the Sinaloa cartel, once led by the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, known as CJNG. The Sinaloa cartel has been in the drug business for decades. They built their empire on marijuana and cocaine, but saw the potential of methamphetamine early on. They invested in super labs, hired chemists, and built distribution networks that reached every corner of the United States. The CJNG is a newer and much more violent organization. They emerged in the power vacuum left by the takedown of other cartels and rapidly expanded their operations. They are known for their extreme brutality, their willingness to wage open war on rivals and the Mexican government, but they are also known for their business acumen. They streamlined production, cut costs, and flooded the market with cheap, high-purity methamphetamine, driving out competitors. The scale of their production is difficult to comprehend. A single superlab can produce hundreds of kilograms of methamphetamine per week. The cartels operate dozens, perhaps hundreds of these facilities, hidden in remote areas of Mexico and increasingly in Central America. Precursor chemicals, primarily ephedrine, pseudoephedrine, and phenylacetic acid, are imported by the ton from China and India. Chinese chemical companies operating in a legal gray area produce and export these substances ostensibly for legitimate purposes, but they know full well where they are really going. The finished product is smuggled across the border through a complex network of routes and methods. It travels in trucks, hidden in secret compartments built into the frames. It travels in cars driven by unsuspecting mules who have been coerced or paid to cross the border. It travels in semi-trailers with legitimate cargo, the drugs buried deep inside pallets of avocados or home appliances. It even moves through tunnels, sophisticated underground passages with ventilation, lighting, and rail systems, emerging in warehouses in Arizona or California. Once across the border, the methamphetamine is distributed through a multi-layered network. Wholesale distributors, often based in cities like Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Dallas, buy in bulk and sell to regional dealers. These regional dealers sell to street-level dealers who sell to consumers. Each level of the organization is insulated from the others, a cellular structure designed to protect the upper echelons from law enforcement. The violence associated with this trade is staggering. In Mexico, cartel wars have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Journalists, police officers, politicians, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire have been murdered. Entire towns have been terrorized. The Mexican government, despite deploying the military and spending billions on enforcement, has been unable to break the cartel's power. In many regions, the cartels are the de facto government, providing security, resolving disputes, and even building infrastructure. These are narco-states within a state. And the profits are so vast that corruption is inevitable. Cartel money has penetrated law enforcement, the judiciary, and the highest echelons of government in both Mexico and Central America. It has reached into the United States as well. Police officers, border agents, and prison guards have been caught facilitating drug shipments. The cartels have the resources to buy almost anyone, and they do. For more than half a century, the dominant approach to the methamphetamine problem and to drug policy in general has been prohibition and criminalization. This is an approach based on the belief that drug use is a moral failing, a personal choice made by weak or bad people, and that the solution is punishment. Arrest the users, imprison the dealers, eradicate the supply, and the problem will disappear. It hasn't worked. By any objective measure, the war on drugs has been a catastrophic, costly failure. Despite spending over $1 trillion in the U.S. alone, despite imprisoning millions of people, despite deploying military resources to fight cartels, drugs are cheaper, purer, and more available today than at any point in history. Methamphetamine use has not decreased. It has exploded. The policy designed to solve the problem has instead exacerbated it, creating the perfect conditions for a black market to thrive. The criminalization of drug use has had devastating social consequences. In the United States alone, more than 1.5 million people are arrested annually on drug charges. A disproportionate number of them are people of color, despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups. A drug conviction, even for simple possession, can destroy a person's life. It makes it nearly impossible to find a job, secure housing, qualify for student loans, or public assistance. It is a life sentence to marginalization and poverty. Incarceration, not treatment, has become the standard response to addiction. Prisons are filled with people whose primary problem is not criminality, but a substance use disorder. Behind bars, they receive little to no treatment. They are released, often with no support system, no job prospects, and no place to live, directly back into the same environment where drugs are readily available. The rate of recidivism is staggeringly high. The revolving door of the prison system spins endlessly. Meanwhile, the supply-side approach, the attempt to shut down drug production and trafficking, has been equally futile. For every lab that is raided, 5 new ones open. For every dealer arrested, 10 more are ready to take their place. The economic incentives are simply too strong. As long as there is demand, there will be supply. And the iron laws of economics dictate that prohibition only makes the product more valuable, more profitable, and more attractive to criminal organizations. The focus on punishment rather than treatment has also starved the healthcare system of resources. Treatment facilities are scarce, especially in rural areas where the meth epidemic rages most fiercely. Waiting lists are long, sometimes months long. Many programs require payment, which users, often having lost everything, simply cannot afford. And the available treatments are often inadequate, underfunded, and poorly staffed. There is also the problem of stigma. Societal attitudes toward drug users, shaped by decades of war on drugs propaganda, are ones of condemnation and contempt. Users are seen as addicts, junkies, criminals, morally fallen people. This stigma prevents people from seeking help out of fear and shame. It isolates them, drives them deeper into addiction, and makes recovery exponentially more difficult. It also shapes policy, making punitive approaches politically popular while compassionate, evidence-based approaches are dismissed as being soft on crime. The failure of prohibition has led some jurisdictions to explore radically different approaches. Portugal, in 2001, decriminalized the possession of all drugs for personal use, including methamphetamine. Instead of arrest and prosecution, users are referred to dissuasion commissions, composed of social workers, psychologists, and legal advisors. They assess the user's situation and recommend treatment if necessary. The results have been remarkable. Contrary to fears, drug use did not increase. Overdose deaths plummeted. HIV infection rates among injecting drug users fell by over 90%. Drug-related crime decreased. It is a model that prioritizes public health over punishment, and it works. But in the United States and many other countries, such approaches remain politically contentious. There is a deep cultural and political commitment to the war on drugs, an ingrained belief that punishment is the only answer. And so the cycle continues. Arrest, incarceration, release, and repeat. Prisons fill up, the death toll rises, and the cartels get richer. Treating methamphetamine addiction is one of the most difficult challenges in modern medicine. Unlike opioid addiction, for which we have effective pharmacological treatments like methadone and buprenorphine, replacement therapy, there is no equivalent medication for methamphetamine. There is no pill you can take to ease the cravings, to stabilize brain chemistry. Recovery from methamphetamine addiction relies almost entirely on behavioral interventions, and these are difficult, time-consuming, and unfortunately often unsuccessful. The gold standard of treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This approach teaches users to recognize the triggers and thought patterns that lead to drug use and to develop coping strategies to avoid relapse. It requires a skilled therapist, a motivated patient, and a significant time commitment. In an ideal world, this would be combined with stable housing, employment support, and a strong social network. But these resources are rarely available, especially for the populations most affected by methamphetamine addiction. Another evidence-based approach is contingency management, which uses positive reinforcement to encourage abstinence. Patients regularly submit urine samples, and if the samples are drug-free, they receive a reward: food vouchers, small amounts of money, or privileges within the treatment program. It sounds simple, almost trivial, but research has shown it to be one of the most effective methods. The brain, damaged by methamphetamine and unable to experience natural rewards, can be retrained through these external incentives. Over time, as the brain heals, the patient begins to find reward in other, healthier activities. Inpatient treatment programs, where users live in a structured, drug-free environment for an extended period, from 30 days to a year, can also be effective. These programs provide intensive therapy, peer support, and a respite from the environment and relationships that contributed to their addiction. But they are expensive, spots are limited, and many insurance plans do not cover them. The reality is that most people with methamphetamine addiction receive no treatment at all. They cycle in and out of the criminal justice system, they overdose, they die. And even for those who do access treatment, the success rate is dismal. Relapse is the norm rather than the exception, often within the first year after treatment. The brain changes caused by methamphetamine are so profound, the psychological pull so strong, that recovery is a lifelong, daily struggle. However, there is hope in new research. Scientists are actively exploring new pharmacological approaches. One promising avenue is the use of medications that modulate the dopamine and glutamate systems, helping to restore balance without producing a high. Another is the development of a methamphetamine vaccine that would prompt the immune system to produce antibodies that bind to methamphetamine molecules in the bloodstream, preventing them from crossing the blood-brain barrier and reaching the brain. These are still in the early stages of research, but they represent a potential paradigm shift in the treatment of stimulant addiction. There is also a growing recognition of the importance of addressing the underlying factors that contribute to addiction, trauma, poverty, mental illness, and social isolation. Methamphetamine is often a symptom of deeper systemic problems. People use it to escape pain, to numb traumatic memories, to feel powerful in a world that makes them feel powerless. Effective treatment must address not only the drug use itself, but also the life circumstances and psychological wounds that led to it. This requires a holistic approach that integrates medical care, psychotherapy, social support, and economic opportunities. The story of methamphetamine is, ultimately, a story about us, about our capacity for genius and our capacity for self-destruction, about the unintended consequences of our most brilliant innovations and the systems we build to manage them, often with catastrophic results. A Japanese chemist, seeking to understand an ancient medicinal plant, created a molecule that would fuel the armies of World War II, devastate post-war Japan, transform American culture, enrich Mexican cartels, and leave a trail of broken lives across the globe. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Methamphetamine was a miracle of science, a tool for enhancing human performance, for treating illness, for improving lives. But we underestimated its power. We failed to see that a chemical that could make soldiers march without sleep could also shatter their minds. We failed to see that a pill that could help a student focus could also trap them in a lifetime of addiction. We failed to see that prohibition would not end use. It would only criminalize it and hand control to the most violent and ruthless players in society. The shadow methamphetamine casts is long and dark, and we are still standing in it. Hundreds of thousands of people are addicted right now, at this very moment. Thousands will die this year. Children will be taken from their parents. Communities will continue to fracture, and cartels will continue to produce, traffic, and profit from human misery. But in this darkness, there are also glimmers of light. There are people in recovery, people who have climbed out of the abyss and are living full, meaningful lives, often dedicated to helping others. There are researchers developing new treatments, policymakers experimenting with new, more humane approaches, and activists fighting to change hearts and minds. There are parents who have lost children who are channeling their grief into action, demanding change. There are clinicians, social workers, and volunteers who show up every day, saving lives, offering hope where there is almost none left. The story of methamphetamine teaches us that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, that every simple solution creates new, more complex problems, and that the war on drugs is really a war on people, often the most vulnerable among us. But it also teaches us that recovery is possible, that compassion is more powerful than punishment, and that the only way forward is to move together with understanding and resolve. The molecule that Nagai Nagayoshi synthesized in that laboratory in 1893 cannot be uncreated. It exists, and it will always exist. The question now is not how to destroy it, but how to live with it, how to minimize its harm, and how to help those who have fallen under its spell find their way back to the light. The secret military drug that became a global epidemic is still with us, still taking lives, still destroying communities. But the story is not over. It is being written right now by every person who chooses recovery, by every policy that prioritizes health over punishment, by every moment of compassion shown to someone who is suffering. The shadow is long, but we can and must walk toward the light.